All right, welcome to my timeline walkthrough of American immigration. So we're going to be focusing primarily on um, American immigration's effect on Asian Americans. So let's get started. So in 1790, this is going to kick off our timeline. The Naturalization Act was passed, and this act allowed for a path to citizenship but only to free white men and the children of those free white men. Um, and about 50 years after that, we had the Irish potato famine, which resulted in a mass migration of uh, Irish people to the United States, which is a little bit outside of the scope of the Asian American focus that I'm going to be looking to take. But in 1849, California uh, became a hub for immigrants because gold was found in 1848. Um, and one of the predominant groups of these immigrants were Chinese men. And the result of this was that they were met with a lot of opposition from white Americans and were thus faced with high tax rates as well as racist attacks, which is going to set the scene for the focus that I want to take today. In 1882, this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we'll get into. Um, First, though, the Page Act was passed in 1875, which was not directly written to affect Chinese immigrants, but uh, this was the main group that this act was enforced upon, um, and worked to slow immigration from China. The Homestead Act we're not going to focus on as much, but this happened in 1862, and it promised land to people that would promise to build a house on these lands. So now we're getting into the next section of our timeline from 1880 to 1921, which started off with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It was the first law passed federally to prohibit immigration based on one specific nationality. There's not been another since, but it immediately instituted a 10-year ban on Chinese immigrants, um, which was later extended by the Geary Act in 1892, 10 years later. Also in 1892, Ellis Island was established, but we're not going to focus on that as much. So following the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Geary Act, it became clear that Americans had spiteful sentiments towards the Asian population, which we saw in San Francisco. As in 1806, there was an order passed on a school board to separate the Asian children within the elementary schools. And seeing as the Chinese children had already been segregated, this had the highest impact on the Japanese. So the president at the time, President Roosevelt, was in a difficult situation because the Japanese government was growing in power. They had just won a war against the Russians. But he also had to listen to the population of America, and so ended up making a compromise in which Japanese American students would stay in school, and the Japanese government agreed to limit immigration from Japan, not halt, but limit. And this agreement will play a role later. And then there was the Dillingham Commission, which in 1911, which definitely had a large impact, but again, we're not going to be focusing on this as much. So in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act was passed, and it introduced a per nation quota. So each nation had a different quota of how many immigrants they were allowed to send, for a total of 350,000 immigrants from all countries yearly. And the majority of this allotment was given to Europe, and China and other Asian countries were met with continued exclusion, very, very small quotas, if any. In 1924, the government decided to get even more restrictive with their legislation. The quota system was here to stay, um, and they decided that they wanted to limit the quotas. So not only did they push the quota from each country from 3% to 2%, they also moved the census on which this quota was based um, from 1910 to the census of 1890, 20 years earlier, which lowered the number, um, and thus the census was lower, and thus the quota was lower. Um, and this also contained a provision that excluded the Japanese from immigrating entirely, which broke the gentleman's agreement that we just discussed. And then we have the Tydings-McDuffie Act, um, which also ties into our Asian American theme. Basically, until this act, because the Philippines was a colony of the United States was not able to limit Filipino immigration, but they gave independence to the Philippines and thus were able to dramatically limit immigration, making the quota 50 people a year, which basically all but ended Filipino immigration. In 1939, World War II began, which was very impactful for immigration into America. We had the United States and Japan already had tense relations, and then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, um, and we declared war against Japan as well as the Axis of Powers. At the same time, we rejected the SS St. Louis, which is again out of scope of our focus, but it was a horrible act that resulted in 255 of the Jewish passengers on board dying during World War II. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. This stripped any restrictions that were based on race for citizenship by naturalization, but the immigration quotas still were very restrictive against specifically Asian immigrants, with only 2,000 total Asian immigrants per year allowed into the United States. It was a small step in the right direction, but it was still very restrictive. Now we're getting into the timeline from 1965 to 1990. And in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was passed, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. And this was a first step out of race-based restrictiveness towards immigration, and allowed every country to have an immigration quota of 20,000, which is 10 times the number that was previously allowed for all Asian countries. And so this represented the first real opportunity for immigration outside Europe, and also represents the first shift in American attitudes towards immigration for a long time. And around the same time, also outside of the scope, the Mariel boat lift happened, and that basically ended up in a lot of Cuban refugees from the regime of Fidel Castro. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay. In 1980, President Johnson, following the Vietnam War, gave an executive order that allowed Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees to flee their war-torn countries and seek refugee status in the United States. Basically, Congress was on board with this, but it wasn't very regulated because it was an executive order that President Johnson gave. So they wrote legislature so that it would be more regulated. And this act, the Refugee Act of 1980, tripled the yearly allowance of refugees and contained a provision that we would be able to raise that ceiling further under emergency situations. We're not going to get too much into the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It just happened under the Reagan administration, and made it so that employers who employed illegal immigrants would face civic and criminal penalties. But the major importance of this bill came from the fact that those who had immigrated before 1982 were offered legal residence and a path to legal citizenship. So it was very influential for immigration as a whole, but not specifically to Asian Americans. And then 1990 comes around, and Congress decides to edit the Immigration Act of 1965, which continued to ease the process of immigration into the United States, and also offered a path through something called a diversity visa to these countries that were limited by the Hart-Celler Act. A major importance from this bill was that immigrants from African countries were able to significantly benefit. We're not going to focus on that too much, but the greater immigration cap was set to 700,000, and also introduced an easier way for people to immigrate due to work. And it helped permit the entry of 20 million people over the next 2 decades, which was the largest influx in immigration that we had in 20 years since the nation was founded. Coming through to today, there is less about Asian Americans. They were significantly helped by these acts that I referred to earlier. But basically, in 1986, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was passed, which made it a lot more difficult to immigrate illegally, which significantly slowed the process for immigrating legally because more people were trying to do it. And there's a backlog today of about 500,000 cases of people trying to immigrate legally. September 11th in 2001 was a hugely important moment in American history, especially for immigration, and led to a lot of feelings of Islamophobia after Al-Qaeda carried out a terrorist attack in which they hijacked 4 planes, 3 of which connected with their targets, and killed a huge amount of Americans. This led to President Bush starting the quote-unquote war on terrorism, which would go on to have drastic effects on immigration policy. We can see that from the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002, which was aimed to strengthen our borders. And it called both for more workers, but also new measures in which every foreign visitor that wanted to enter the United States had to have travel documents. A little bit more outside of the scope, same-sex marriages were legalized in 2013, which led to same-sex couples from different countries being able to have their marriages federally recognized, and thus were able to apply for family-based immigration petitions. The last piece was a refugee ban from 2017 when President Donald Trump ran for president in 2016. One of his major topics was his anti-immigration agenda, building a wall between Mexico and the United States, etc. And in 2017, in his second year as president, he decided to close the American borders to several Muslim-majority countries, including Syria, which was very controversial at the time. And it remained in place until it was removed by President Biden in 2021. So here are sources for that last chunk of history from 1991 to today. In short, to conclude, Asian Americans, the immigration for them, the story kind of starts with the California Gold Rush, in which there was a high influx of Chinese immigrants into California. Japanese and Filipino people later faced the same aggression from the American populace, and it resulted in, for a long time, it was very difficult, if not impossible, to immigrate from Asia. But from the time period of about 1960 to 1990, these measures were taken out, and it was made easier.